Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to Planning Lessons and Units, part of our course, Curriculum and Methods in Secondary Ed at Misericordia University. In this video, let's begin by reviewing Gagne's model for instruction, and then let's examine the Misericordia lesson plan in which we will apply knowledge of Gagne's model. Let's focus specifically on reviewing the writing of sound instructional objectives, drawing up a concept map. Let's look at the other elements in the lesson plan, including the 9 steps of instruction. Let's begin by reviewing Robert Gagne's 9 significant events in instruction model. Gagne's model is part of a systematic design process of instruction. And as you're probably well aware, Misericordia has chosen to make this the basis of our lesson plan. So let's here look at the first 3 steps. These are things you do as you're getting into the instructional process before you really start teaching. Number 1, Gagne says, gain the attention of the learners. It's critical to focus the learners. And Gagne says, don't only just do it at the beginning of the lesson, do it as often as necessary throughout the lesson. But definitely, right at the beginning, you need to do it. Step 2 is inform the learner of the objectives. Now, this is important. On our lesson plan, we normally just say the teacher will do this. But it's very important to do this and share this with the learners, because it's an advanced organizer. It tells the learners what to expect they're going to learn this day. So this helps the learner's brain prepare to accept that new material and fit it into their existing schema, the way that they understand this portion of this content area. The third step in instruction is to help the learner recall prerequisite information. In other words, when we look at learning from a constructivist point of view, learners will build their understanding of the content, and they'll build it on what they already know. So because of that, it's critical to let them know what they already know, help rejuvenate those understandings, those memories, and they get the electricity, literally actually, flowing in that part of their brain so they remember what they know about that content before any new content is delivered. Steps 4 through 8 represent what the teacher does in delivering new content and practicing it with students. Step 4 is present the instruction. So this is the teaching part. You deliver new content. Step 5 is guided practice. Now, guided practice means that you're going to help the students work through that material, through some examples, through some practice, through some clarification. So it could be done in the form of examples. It could even be done in the form of seat work or group work. Step 6 is independent practice. For independent practice, this is something where students are going to, like as the teacher, you step back a little bit more, and you're not directly helping the students now. So when you look at it, present instruction, it's you delivering the content. Step 5, you are helping the students. Step 6, you've backed off even more, and now the student is working more independently. Now, independent practice can take the form of seat work, where you're not directly right there helping, but you're available, or it could take the form of homework, where the students are working outside of class and you're not there present to help at all at that point. And at all times throughout this process, we're providing feedback to students, helping them see what is right and what is wrong, and in both cases, why. And then finally in this area, in this section, step 8 is assess their performance. And this means that both formally and informally, we're going to be monitoring, engaging student acquisition of the content. At the end of a unit, we'll give a test. Maybe part ways through a unit, we'll give a quiz or project or some other kind of activity like that. Um, we may give homework, and then we'll assess through that. So those are formal means. But in addition, a teacher needs to constantly be monitoring to make sure students are understanding, comprehending, and acquiring the content appropriately. The last step, according to Gagne's model, is step 9, enhance retention and transfer. And what this means is we want to help students retain the material and also be able to apply it to new situations. And normally this takes two different forms. The first form is at the end of a class period, we review with students. We help them recall. That helps bring closure to, oh, this is what we said we're going to learn today. Then we recalled the prerequisite information. Then we learned. Now let's review it. And then the transfer portion, that's the second part of this, the second form, we would then say, now this is how this lesson and or this content is going to fit in to the broad scheme of things. So in other words, we help the students see how the learning fits in with other lessons within this unit and how this unit, even further, fits in with other things that they have learned, so that it's not like one isolated bit of information, but rather it fits in to a whole understanding of something. Let's explore these steps in a little deeper way by seeing what a teacher can practically do in applying these steps. As we take a deeper dive here into this model, in the first steps, we're trying to help the students prepare for learning. For gaining attention, a teacher needs to create a sense of curiosity. You can do that in a bunch of ways. Now, in some cases, you want to call the class to attention, and that's good. I mean, that certainly will gain their attention and settle them down and have them listen to you. But even more so, it would be good to create that sense of curiosity, maybe pose a problem, show a video, introduce a novel concept or a different viewpoint, or use some attention-getting device that's going to draw them in, not just to settle down and listen, but to draw them into what you're going to be working with and presenting to them. So gain attention is the first and most critical step in the whole process. Step 2, inform the learner of the objectives. Now you can do this in a number of ways. Some teachers will just state the objectives. In some cases, the teacher will also maybe even write or project onto the wall even not only what the objectives are, but how these objectives relate to the standards. Some teachers will do this graphically or visually. Some teachers will say, what do you think, based on our attention-getting activity, what do you think we're going to learn today? So through all of this, we want to create that excitement and that interest and that need for the students to want to master these objectives. Sometimes new teachers kind of gloss over this third step, help the learner recall the prerequisite information. But what's important here, as we already mentioned, is that we want to prepare the students to scaffold their learning and build and fortify their neural networks. We want them to be able to build upon prior understanding. So we start by stimulating their recall of what they already do understand about this. And by the way, in the process, sometimes a teacher discovers, and or the learner does, that something that they thought they knew, they learned incorrectly or inaccurately. So we have to correct that along the way. So we can ask for responses that stimulate the recall. We could start by just mentioning it. You'll recall that we're going to do such and such today. You'll recall that you already know how to do these other parts that lead up to it. You can review some of those things. You could, in some cases, though, the students may need a little refresher on that. You can, again, talk about them. You can list them visually. You can review some key vocabulary if that's appropriate in your content area. You can review what has been studied before. In some way, you want to get the, so to speak, juices flowing in their brain so they remember what they knew about this content so they can build upon it. Present instruction is, of course, when we deliver new content. Now, throughout this course, we're going to look at a variety of methods, pedagogy, and different things that you can use, different techniques, different best practices. So for now, let's suffice to say that there are a lot of different things here, and some you'll know about, and some maybe we'll shed some new light on, and we may shed some light on some new techniques and methods that you haven't tried before. But ultimately, the ideal is for the teacher to present new material in a variety of ways because this allows for learner differences. We're going to try to build in as much active learning so the learner is as active as possible. We're going to watch cognitive overload. We're going to talk all about that. We're going to use additional materials, multimedia materials, as much as possible to make it a more rich and robust presentation. We're going to use many examples. We can use illustrations, and we can also use fuzzy examples and non-examples to help the students learn the material better. And then throughout the process, we'll ask questions of students so that we engage them in the learning process. After you present some content, we move to step 5. You give some guided practice, and this means that you kind of step back a little bit and make them stand on their feet, so to speak, a little bit more with the content. So you could provide an activity like seat work so they can start practicing the skill. Now, again, they could do it individually or in a small group. You could do think, pair, share. But the idea is it's guided practice. You're going to be there to guide, but they're doing something. You can walk around and help students during this time while they do this practice. You can help them clarify any fuzzy understandings of the material. If you have the technology available, this is a good time to use student response systems or clickers. You can embed questions within instruction to actively engage the learners throughout. The 6th step is to allow the independent practice. And again, we step back a little bit farther from the students. They take more responsibility for applying this content now. And that's what we're going to ask them to do. We want them to apply this content, this new content, to solve some kind of problem. Now, we can either do something in class or we can give something for homework. Throughout instruction, we're always providing feedback. We use reinforcing, corrective, and remedial feedback. We help the student understand how answers were derived, what makes one response better, more appropriate than another, and you clarify common misunderstandings. At times we provide this feedback to the whole group, and sometimes it's on a one-to-one basis for individual feedback. We want to clarify any areas of confusion. And the other piece is, if we see that a number of students are not getting it, maybe we need to reteach part of that content to make sure everyone has a strong understanding of the content. Assessing performance is critical throughout the learning process. So we assess frequently throughout instruction, not just at the end of a unit of instruction, but rather we do it all the time, ongoing, in addition to at the end of a unit of instruction, to identify thoroughly how the learners are understanding and grasping the content. We utilize a number of ways of doing this. We can do informal assessments. We can do teacher observation, and certainly formal measures as well, like assignments, quizzes, and tests. Let's finish this section by diving deeper into step 9, enhancing retention and transfer. Again, 2 flavors here. The first part is review the lesson content with your students as you bring the lesson to a close. That's critical for the learner to see how everything fits in from the time that you stated the objectives, then they looked at the material, and then they are now bringing it to a close so they see how it all fits in. The second flavor is the transfer, the retention transfer part. Avoid isolating content. Describe how whatever they're learning fits in to the unit. So say something like, well, today we did this, tomorrow we will be studying this other part, and show them how it's going to connect. And then further, to help the retention and transfer over the long haul, Gagne says, after giving a test, go over it. Explain how the answers came about, like why is something the appropriate answer, how did you get to it? Clear up any areas of confusion. Reteach anything that's not mastered. Distribute practice over time. In other words, refer to this content down the road so students see that they still need it and remember how to deal with it. Relate future learning to this content where appropriate. Allow the learner to apply this learning in different new situations. And finally, always try to make the content more robust, make it more usable to more learners by adding additional material or resources that can speak to some students. Having considered Gagne's model, which is the basis for the Misericordia lesson plan, let's now look at instructional planning, and let's start with the lesson plan. Let's begin by reviewing the lesson plan, and let's take it in sections. So to begin with, you'll start off with, of course, your name and the date and so on. Then we'll list the standards that are addressed. So in the standards area, actually write out the standard and include the number of the standard right here. Then name the topic that you're going to teach in just a few words. So here it's the generally overall topic, not what the students will do or anything like that. It's the topic name. Then we'll write the objectives of the lesson. So the objectives, we know that the student will be doing these things. So you don't have to write the student will all the time. We understand that. But when you start writing the objective, in your mind say the student will, and then write the objective. Don't state the activity of the lesson. Don't say what you're going to do or what the teacher is going to do. Again, the student will. So it must be learner-centered and it must be operationalized to allow for assessment. So we don't want to use terms like the student will be able to or understand or will know or will comprehend. We have to talk about what they will be able to do when they complete this lesson. Let's pause for a moment and review the writing of objectives. A well-written objective should include a verb and a statement of what the learner outcome will be. Again, it's going to be what the student will be able to do at the conclusion of this lesson. We want to use an action verb that specifies an observable behavior. When you do that, we say that it's operationalized. And then we base our assessment on those objectives, because we can say the student will perform X, then we can assess, can they perform X? We'll take a look at some verbs and some words we can use in objectives in a moment. So again, we're describing student performance. This is not what the teacher is going to do at all. It's student focused. An objective should include one intended learning outcome per objective. So we make sure we don't have several things the students will be able to accomplish, just one per objective. Make sure that it's easy to understand, it's unambiguous, it's student-oriented, it's very straightforward, and it's observable and measurable behavior, so that when someone reads that objective, they'll understand, oh, this is what the student will actually physically perform when this lesson is finished. I'm just going to take a moment and drill down on this just a little bit more. Can we talk about a goal? Like, what's the purpose of the lesson? The goal of the lesson. Well, that's what the lesson's about, or what the basically the teacher's going to do. But when we talk about objectives, we're talking about actual behaviors that the students will display, and their specific statements. And again, keep in mind the student will, and then write the objective. So all of these behaviors will be quantifiable. In other words, we can measure them, and they form the basis of assessing whether or not the students have met the objectives for the lesson. And when students can be competent in these different areas, they meet these competencies, then we say that that education is successful. And this is also known as criterion referenced education, or by any of the other names that are listed here. When we are considering objectives, realize that mostly we're looking for overt performance, meaning something that you directly observe and it's easy to assess it. But sometimes there is covert performance, something that's not directly observable. It happens inside of a person, so that's not easy to watch for, and it's not easy to assess. So examples of that would be, in some content areas, a standard might call for, we want the student to appreciate something, or to discover, or to understand. Those are nebulous terms. How do you know somebody appreciates something or they don't? Well, in that case, a teacher will look to observe a behavior that indicates that they are appreciating, or are understanding, or are discovering, or are seeing a bigger picture of something. Because again, we're looking at something that we can identify and measure in the behavior of a student. Now, we realize that you may be really excited and enthused to get right into the instructional process, but realize that the objective planning is critical to good instruction. And here's why. The objectives can help you focus your planning. They can help you plan effective instructional activities. They can help you plan valid evaluation and assessment procedures, because the objectives ultimately help ensure that what we're planning to teach is being taught, it is being practiced, and it is being assessed. That's why we do objectives, so we can't rush over this step. So when you are writing objectives, we talked about the measurable and the observable. Look at the words in this list. Appreciate, we already talked about. Believe. We'd like students to believe something, or to grasp something, to indicate, to know, to like something. Those are not directly observable items. So we do not use those types of verbs in planning our objectives. Now look at this list of verbs. These are all very specific action items that we can tell if a student can do or they can't do. And we can gauge how well can they perform it. Can they identify certain things? Can they, choosing various things here, can they draw something? Can they analyze? Can they predict? Can they explain? Can they divide? Can they separate? Can they infer something from what they're looking at? Those are all things that you can measure. So use verbs like this in planning your objectives. Here you will see pictured Bloom's taxonomy, the original one on the left, and the new version on the right. The new version was embarked on because of new technologies and new ways that students can go beyond what was suggested in the original taxonomy. Now, teachers can use this Bloom's taxonomy to help students scaffold up their learning and fortify their neural networks. And what it means for us practically is, as teachers, when we're writing objectives, we can write an objective at the remembering level, and then let's do an objective at the understanding level as they start to get deeper into the content and understand it more deeply. Then we can have them apply something and analyze and so on. Let's take a look at some verbs that would signify that we're writing at those different levels. So we'd start off at the remembering level. So our first objective could be something like define something or recall it or recognize it or name it or identify it at the very basic level of understanding. And then we could ask a student to go further and demonstrate understanding of it, describe it, compare it, rephrase it, put it on your own words, explain the main idea here, and so on. That's at the second level. After the students can remember and understand content, now let's have them apply content. Let's have them classify or choose or solve or write an example of something or create a chart of something. That's all application of the knowledge to specific tasks. After they can apply it, let's have them go a step further and see if they can analyze. So can they summarize something or compare things? Can they order, sequence, categorize, classify? Can they draw conclusions from something? Can they take a position and justify a position on some content? After that level, then let's write an objective that deals with evaluating. At this point now, they can judge, they can decide between different choices, they can evaluate and assess, give opinions, they can make recommendations. If they can do all of these steps based on Bloom's hierarchy, then they're ready for the last step in the hierarchy, and that is creating something based on all their experience with this content. Can they produce something, write something, design, develop, solve, estimate, make something, construct something, predict something? That's the highest level of demonstration of their knowledge in a certain area. As we're looking at objectives, the first thing that you might want to do, even before you create or as soon as you create the objective, is to draw your concept map. Now, a concept map at Misericordia will look like this. Start off with your lesson title, the standards, so summarize the standards here, and then list out the objectives. That's what the students should be able to actually perform after the class has ended. Now, how are you going to practice that? Well, that's the activities. So for each objective, there should be some activity or activities that will practice that. How are you going to assess those activities? So are you going to observe them? Are you going to grade them? Like, well, what are you going to do to make sure that they're acquiring that information and satisfying that objective? And then what's the grading criteria? Let's take a look at an example of this. So as we look at the example, we'll start off by writing the title, and then we're going to summarize what the standards are. Now, when we look at the standards, notice we're going right back to what we should be teaching, and then we're going to write our objectives based on that. So what are the standards? Okay, am I covering that in these objectives? And I've only listed 2 objectives here. Remember that the purpose of the planning and the objectives is to ensure that what you're supposed to teach, you are setting out to teach, you are practicing with the students, you're observing and assessing with the students. The bottom line is you want to make sure that they learn that content. So, title, standards, objectives. Underneath each objective, we want to have some activities. How are you going to practice this material? What are you going to do with the students? What are they doing to practice this? And then, how are you going to assess those things? That's this line down here. So if they're going to do a journal, well, we're going to look at the completion of the journal. And as part of that, how are we going to grade it? Well, there's 5 items. We're going to correct out of how many correct they got out of the 5. If it's an in-class discussion, the teacher is going to observe that, and the teacher will consider the participation and the correct, incorrect responses and the level of responses of each student. If they're going to do a worksheet, they're going to complete the worksheet, and then it'll be correct out of so many items. Now we're ready to move on to the actual instructional part, the Gagne's 9 steps portion of the lesson plan. You notice that here we have the 9 steps. We've got the activities that we're going to engage in. Then we've got the time estimate. Now, realize that we're going to estimate to the best of our ability each step along the way. We'll have a time here, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 20 minutes. Realize that your perfection of this section will come in time as you do this. Because when you teach a lesson, you'll realize, well, this only took 5 minutes, and I thought it would take 10, and I thought it would take 10, but really it only took 5, or it really required 20. This will change, but you're better off thinking through it carefully so that you don't run short of material. And speaking of which, materials that you're going to use, list them over here in this column to the level that if a person is going to substitute for you in your absence, that they'll know what to do and what to use. So don't just say a PowerPoint, a video. Well, what the PowerPoint is there a name to it? Is there a video? Is it on YouTube? Do you have the exact URL? List it down so someone could take your place if needed. Now let's look at the steps. Gain attention. You don't have to script every word you're going to say in this section, but say, what are you going to do to motivate and draw the attention of the learner? State objective. You can just say the teacher will state the objectives. You don't have to mark them down again. We already have them listed at the top of the lesson plan, but this is a reminder to the teacher, don't forget to do this important step. Facilitate recall. Remember that we're not just reviewing, but we're helping learners recall what they already know, because they're going to build on that information. So sometimes it is a little bit of review, but the key thing is to help them remember what they already know and don't know about this content. Then we present new information. How are you going to do this? Are you lecturing, showing a video? Like what are your steps? Mark down those steps here. Guided practice. You might be referring to the teacher, maybe to the student, maybe to both. Are you doing examples together? Are you giving students a worksheet? They're going to do something separately. Like, how are you going to do that? Same thing with the independent practice. What are you going to do to step back a little farther from the students? You're going to give them examples to do. Are they going to work in groups? Are they going to do some homework outside of class? List those things down so you're well thought through and well planned out. In step 7, we provide feedback. Now remember that we're going to provide feedback every step of the way. So if it's specific items we're doing up here, we can say, well, we're going to deal with those particular things and provide feedback. But this is more of a reminder to the teacher. We're always providing helpful, constructive feedback to the students. Conducting assessment is important. We said that it can be informal, it can be formal, it can be observation by the teacher. So when you're presenting new information, how are you going to assess? When you're doing guided practice, how are you going to assess? When you're doing independent practice, how are you going to assess? So notice, in some cases it's informal, in some cases the teacher is observing, teacher observation, discussion, or some more formal activities. And then the last step, schedule elaboration, we will close the lesson And we'll also describe how this fits in to the unit and describe what's going to go on at the next class. The very last portion of the lesson plan calls for accommodations and self-critique. So let's say a couple words on these two sections to wrap up today's lesson. Sometimes new teachers gloss over the accommodations section. Remember, you're going to encounter a lot of diversity in your classroom. So it's important to consider the unique needs of those students in your classroom and plan to reach their educational needs by listing accommodations for those students. You have English learners, students with physical disabilities, cognitive, IEPs, special needs. How are you going to adapt your lesson activities and materials for them? So activities and materials. And in Misericordia, we describe our HALO method. And we're going to make accommodations for the high, the average, the low, and others. The self-critique is an important way to finish off your lesson. All teachers evaluate how did everything go, because not everything is going to go exactly as we planned. So maybe we'll alter an approach the next time we would do this. We would shorten something, we would lengthen an activity, we would add another activity that we thought of after the fact. We would add more examples because we encountered students having certain fuzzy understandings or certain common misunderstandings of the content. So the bottom line here is, if I were to do this again, what changes would I make? As we bring this video to a close, let's plan for our next class that you will create a lesson plan, and I'm going to call it at the formative level. And you'll find this listed under Project 2.3 in Module 2 in Blackboard. So for the next class, upload a lesson plan. Now, you don't have to start from scratch at this point, but based on what we've looked at so far, maybe you'd want to take an existing lesson plan you've done and maybe tweak it if it needs it, and make modifications as needed, and then upload it so we can plan to share and discuss and do some peer review at our next class meeting. Now realize that as long as you have covered all of the elements in the lesson plan, that's going to be good, because we'll have an opportunity to re-enter this later on after we do the peer review for actual grading. So plan to share and to talk and discuss, and all together we're going to improve our process of lesson planning. At our next class, in addition to doing the peer review of our lesson plans, we'll also examine several MU documents to help you prepare for student teaching and then in-service teaching beyond that. We're going to take a look at the MU lesson plan. We'll review what we looked at here today and look at it in a little more detail, and we'll look at the Misericordia teacher observation form as well. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you at our next class.